Half an hour before the end of the shift, Alexander Beauvais finds two rivets sheared clean off. He is a Mohawk riveting foreman working high above the St. Lawrence River outside Quebec City in Canada. He reports it to his rivet boss. Beside them, ribs of steel are visibly bending outward. It is 29th of August early in the 20th century, and the longest cantilever arm ever attempted is reaching out over the water. 19,000 tons of steel hang over the water, with 86 men working on it. Then comes the sound, not a crack, but a long grinding roar of metal tearing itself apart. The south arm folds and drops about 45 meters into the river in roughly 15 seconds. 75 workers are killed. 33 of them are Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawak near Montreal. 9 years later, the same crossing will kill 13 more men in a single morning. Steel was the last thing that failed here. The first failure was a question: how do you cross this river? The St. Lawrence at Quebec is close to a kilometer wide, deep, and filled with moving ice each winter. In summer, ferries crossed it. For months every year, the city was cut off from the south shore. Engineers had argued about bridging that water for decades. Every scheme died on the same two problems. Piers could not be founded in the deep central channel, and drifting ice would grind at anything standing there. So the bridge had to cross the channel in a single leap, touching nothing between the banks. The answer was the cantilever, two arms built outward from each shore, meeting in midair over the water. In the late 27 years earlier, a Quebec Bridge Company was chartered to do exactly that. It had ambition and political backing. What it did not have was money or engineering depth. To buy credibility, the company hired the most respected bridge engineer in North America. Theodore Cooper had spent a lifetime on iron and steel and on a reputation for hard judgment. He took the role of consulting engineer for a fee he himself considered far too small. Cooper worked from New York, more than 800 kilometers from the river he was bridging. He was in his 60s and in poor health. Once the steelwork began rising, he stopped coming. The detailed design was produced by the Phoenix Bridge Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, in the United States. Its calculations were the work of Peter Slapka, chief design engineer, who never visited the bridge either. The first plans called for a main span of about 488 meters. Then the span was stretched to 549 meters, the longest in the world. It moved the piers into shallower water and saved money the company did not have. It also made the structure far heavier than the bridge those first calculations described. The dead load, the weight of a structure carrying only itself, had been estimated before that change. Those estimates were never properly redone. The steel grew heavier, the arithmetic behind it stayed still. 26 years later, the real weight of the bridge was running well above the numbers on Slapka's sheets. When the gap was noticed, Cooper judged the extra stress acceptable and let the work continue. No independent engineer ever reviewed that judgment. The government had funded the bridge without checking its design. Out on the water, the arms crept forward. Steel came in by rail and barge, piece by piece. The men who assembled it worked without harnesses, on beams a few centimeters wide. Among them was a crew that had become the most sought-after high-steel gang on the continent. They came from Kanawak, a Mohawk community on the south shore of the St. Lawrence near Montreal. Their reputation began in the 26 years earlier, when a railway bridge was driven across their own territory. Young Mohawk men climbed the unfinished structure for the pleasure of it. The contractors noticed and hired them. Within one generation, Kanawak crews were riveting high steel on great bridges across North America. At Quebec, they made up a large share of the gang working the South Arm. By the summer 27 years later, the South Arm reached far out over the river. The North Bank had not been started. Trains of steel ran out along the finished deck to feed the traveling crane at the tip. Every load added weight that the original design had never been tested against. The bridge was carrying its own failure out over the water, one girder at a time. That summer, workers noticed something strange in the great lower cords beside the main pier. Those cords were the bones of the structure. They carried the entire weight of the arm in compression. Some of them were no longer straight. Ribs of steel had begun to bow gently outward. A young inspector, Norman McClure, measured the bends and wrote about them to Cooper in New York. The Phoenix engineers answered that the bends had probably been made in the shop, before shipping. Nobody could prove it either way. No one had recorded the condition of those cords when they arrived. Through August, the deflection grew. McClure measured again, and the numbers moved the wrong way. The bends were now visible to the eye. Workers on the arm could see the steel curving. Some of them began to say openly that the bridge was moving under them. They kept working anyway. There was no other work on the river that paid like this. By 27th of August, one cord had bent so far that work was halted while the engineers argued. The next morning, the gangs were sent back out, and the loading went on as before. McClure decided he could not settle it by letter. He took a train south to see Cooper. On the morning of the 29th of August, he reached New York and laid the measurements in front of him. Cooper understood at once. Just after midday, he wired the works, add no more load to the bridge. But the telegram went to Phoenixville in Pennsylvania, not to the men standing on the steel. It arrived within the hour. Management decided to settle the matter the following morning. Out at the river, nobody told the gangs to come down. The afternoon shift carried on. The traveling crane hauled another load out toward the open end. There were about 86 men on the structure. Most of them were on the south arm. It was almost 5:30. The day's work was nearly finished. In the last half hour, Beauvais found those sheared rivets and reported them to his rivet boss. A lower cord near the pier buckled. The cord opposite it went the same instant. With that, the arm had nothing left to stand on, and it came down from tip to pier. 19,000 tons of steel, and the men on it fell into the St. Lawrence together. The roar carried across the water to Quebec City, kilometers away. People thought it was an earthquake. Beauvais rode the structure down, wrapped around a cord, and crawled out of the wreck alive. He had a broken leg. His rivet boss, 26 years old, did not come out at all. Boats were on the river within minutes. Men pinned under the waterline could not be cut free. Of the 86 workers on the bridge, only 11 came out of it alive. 75 men were killed, though the official memorial plaque counts 76. 33 were Mohawk from Kanawak. That community of about 2,000 people lost 25 husbands and left 53 children fatherless. The Canadian government appointed a royal commission within days. 3 engineers, led by Henry Holgate, took evidence from everyone who had touched the project. They pulled wreckage from the river and examined the failed cords piece by piece. Their report, delivered in February 1 year later, was blunt. The lower cords had failed in compression. The latticing that tied those built-up cords together was too weak, so they never acted as one member. And the dead load had been underestimated from the start and never recalculated when the span grew. The commission named the 2 men responsible, Theodore Cooper and Peter Slapka. It found that both were able engineers and that both had failed at the work that mattered. It also found that the warnings had been clear and that nobody had held the authority to stop the work. Cooper's career was finished. His name survived in the profession only as a warning. Canada decided to build the bridge again, this time under government control. The second design was heavier, stiffer, and checked by people who were paid to doubt it. This time, the center span would not be built out in mid-air. It would be floated into place. On the morning of 11th of September, 8 years later, thousands of spectators lined both shores to watch it rise. The span had lifted a few meters when a steel casting at its southwest corner fractured. It tipped, tore loose, and went into the river in front of the crowd, with men still on it. 13 workers died. Across both collapses, the crossing had now killed about 88 men. That span is still down there. It was never raised, and a new one had to be built. In September, 1 year later, the replacement was floated out, lifted into place, and this time it held. The first train crossed that October. Regular rail traffic only began on the 3rd of December 2 years later. It still stands, and it is still the longest cantilever span ever built anywhere. At Kanawak, the women demanded that the men never again all work the same high-steel job. Beauvais healed, went back to the trade, and later raised steel memorial crosses at each end of the village. Kanawake ironworkers went on to raise the skylines of Montreal and New York. The disaster changed how engineers are trained and how they are held responsible for what they sign. Since 6 years later, Canadian engineers have received an iron ring in a private ceremony about responsibility. Tradition says those rings were forged from the wreck of this bridge. That part is not true. The first ones were made by wounded war veterans in Toronto. The legend lasts because the lesson does. 2 collapses, about 88 dead, and a record span that Canada is now spending a fortune to save. If McClure's measurements had landed on your desk, what would you have done? Subscribe for the next story.